The courtroom had already decided I was a murderer. Now all that was left was for the judge to tell me how long I'd pay for it. The judge lifted the sentencing papers while my lawyer quietly closed his file. There was nothing left to argue. Across the courtroom, Victor Langford's family watched me with the particular stillness of people who had already decided what I was and were simply waiting for the official confirmation. The prosecution had my fingerprints on the murder weapon, my phone records placing me at the scene, and 12 witnesses who all told variations of the same story with the confident consistency of people who had rehearsed. I had spent 14 months telling anyone who would listen that I did not kill Victor Langford. By the morning of sentencing, I had almost stopped believing myself. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at me with the tired eyes of a man who had delivered sentences for 30 years and had learned to carry the weight of them without showing it. "Emily Carter," he said, "before this court passes sentence." "That's not her name." The voice came from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned simultaneously, the specific unified movement of a room that has been interrupted in a moment it believed was already decided. An elderly woman was standing in the last row. She was small and white-haired, and she held an old photograph in one trembling hand. She was not on the witness list. She was not on the visitor register. She had no business being in that courtroom by any official measure. She looked directly at me. Tears filled her eyes before the words left her mouth. "Rosie," she whispered, "I've finally found you." The name moved through me like cold water. No one had called me Rosie since I was 6 years old. I did not know this woman. I did not know why she was crying. I did not know why a name I barely remembered from a childhood I could hardly recall was currently dismantling every certainty in a courtroom that had spent 14 months building a case against me. But the judge had stopped reading. And for the first time since my arrest, the room felt like it was tilting towards something other than my conviction. If you are new here, welcome to Emerald Novel, where every story is built to keep you up past your bedtime. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Now, let's get back to Emily because that old woman in the back row just changed everything, and she is only getting started. The judge's name was Honorable Warren Cross, and he had the reputation of a man who did not tolerate disruptions. He tolerated this one. He set down the sentencing papers with the deliberate care of someone buying himself time to assess a situation that had moved outside the parameters of his experience, and he looked at the elderly woman in the back row with an expression I could not read from where I was sitting but which my lawyer, standing beside me, later described as recognition. Not of the woman herself, of something she was holding. "Ma'am," the bailiff said, moving toward her. "You need to let her speak," Judge Cross said. The bailiff stopped. My lawyer grabbed my arm. The woman walked forward through the center of the courtroom with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been moving toward this moment for a very long time and was not going to be rushed through it now that she had arrived. She was 70-something, small-boned, wearing a gray coat that had seen better decades, and she walked with a slight unevenness that suggested an old injury rather than age. She stopped at the bar that separated the gallery from the court proper and held up the photograph. "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said, in a voice that was quiet but carried the room the way quiet voices sometimes do when the room is paying complete attention. "I was a housekeeper and nanny for the Hale family of Crestwood County for 19 years. I helped raise this child." She held the photograph higher. "And the child I helped raise is not Emily Carter." My lawyer was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said simultaneously, at the same volume and with the same energy, which created the specific chaos of two people making opposite arguments in the same breath. Judge Cross raised one hand. Both of them stopped. "Approach," he said to Margaret Ellis. She came forward and placed the photograph on the bench in front of him and stepped back. I watched the judge look at it. He looked at it for a long time. Something moved through his expression that I would spend weeks afterward trying to name accurately, something that was not simply surprise or confusion, but the specific quality of a man encountering a piece of information that is rearranging things he believed were already settled. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I took it myself," Margaret said. 23 years ago. 3 weeks before the child in that photograph was placed with another family under a name that was not her own. The courtroom had the specific silence of a room that has forgotten to breathe. I looked at the photograph from where I was sitting. I could see enough of it to understand what it contained. A small girl. An elderly woman beside her. A man standing slightly apart from them, whose face I could not make out at the distance but whose presence in the image had clearly done something significant to the judge currently holding it. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a man who understood that something had just opened that he needed to walk through immediately before it closed. In light of this development, the defense requests an emergency stay of sentencing pending investigation of the evidence presented. The prosecutor objected. Judge Cross was not listening to the prosecutor. He was looking at the photograph. "Granted," he said, without looking up. The prosecutor said something further. Judge Cross set the photograph down and looked at the courtroom with the expression of a man who had just understood something he was not yet ready to say out loud. "We are in recess," he said. "All parties will remain available. Nobody leaves this building." He stood and left the bench. Margaret Ellis turned from the bar and looked at me for the first time since she had approached, directly and without the careful distance she had maintained during her address to the court. Up close she was older than I had understood from the back of the room, her face carrying the specific weariness of someone who had been careful for a very long time and had finally, at considerable personal cost, stopped. Her eyes were the particular red of someone who had been crying before they arrived and had not yet finished. "You don't remember me," she said. It was not a question. "No," I said honestly. She nodded as though this was what she had expected and had prepared herself for. "You will," she said. "When I tell you what I have to tell you, you will remember." I looked at this woman who had walked into my sentencing hearing with a photograph and a name from my early childhood, and I understood that whatever came next was going to require me to revise everything I believed I knew about the first 6 years of my life. That should have been terrifying. Instead it felt, underneath all the fear, like something I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. They put us in a conference room off the main corridor. My lawyer, whose name was Adrian Marsh and who had spent 14 months doing his considerable best with a case that kept producing evidence against his client, sat across from Margaret with the focused attention of a man who understood that the next hour could determine whether the last 14 months had been a prelude or a conclusion. I sat beside him and looked at the woman who had called me Rosie and waited. Margaret opened a bag I hadn't noticed her carrying, worn leather, the kind that had been functional rather than fashionable even when it was new, and produced a folder that she set on the table between us. "I am going to tell you something that begins 23 years ago," she said. "I need you to let me tell it completely before you ask questions, because the questions will make more sense after the whole picture than before it." Adrian nodded. I nodded. Margaret looked at the folder for a moment before she opened it. "Your name is Rosie Hale," she said. "You were born in Crestwood County 29 years ago to James and Catherine Hale. Your father was an attorney. Your mother taught school. I came to work for them when you were 3 months old, and I stayed for 6 years. She paused. "When you were 6, a man named Thomas Langford arranged for your parents to be killed." The room was very quiet. "Thomas Langford," Adrian said carefully. "The father of Victor Langford." "Yes," Margaret said. "The man whose son my client is accused of murdering," Adrian said. "Yes," Margaret said again. I looked at the folder on the table and understood that the 14 months I had spent trying to prove I hadn't killed Victor Langford had been, without my knowing it, a continuation of something that had begun 23 years ago in a county I had no memory of living in. "Why did Thomas Langford have my parents killed?" I asked. "Your father had been building a case," Margaret said. "Quietly over 2 years, as a private attorney retained by an investigative journalist named Carver Willis. Willis had documented evidence connecting Thomas Langford to a series of financial crimes that would have ended both his freedom and his family's position. Your father was preparing to file." She opened the folder. 3 days before the filing date, your parents died in what was officially recorded as a gas leak. "And the journalist?" Adrian asked. "Willis died the same week," Margaret said. "Officially a car accident. I was in the house when your parents died. I got you out. I kept you with me for 2 weeks while I tried to understand what had happened and who I could trust." She looked at me. "I eventually found a police officer named Gerald Osei who had worked with your father. He believed me. He arranged the new identity, the new family, all of it. He told me it was the only way to keep you safe while he built a case against Langford." "And the case?" I asked. Margaret's expression shifted. "Gerald died 8 months later," she said. "Brûlé à suicide. The case died with him." I sat with that for a moment. "And you?" I asked. "What happened to you?" I was placed in witness protection after I gave a statement to a federal investigator who believed enough of what I told him to act on it, she said. The investigation was eventually closed. Insufficient evidence. I stayed hidden because coming out of hiding meant Langford would know you were still alive. She looked at me steadily. I have been watching from a distance for 23 years. I watched you grow up with the Carter family. I watched you go to school and build a life and take a job with a man I knew was the son of the person who destroyed your original one. She paused. I thought Victor Langford was his father's continuation. I was wrong about that. How wrong? Adrian asked. Margaret reached into the folder and produced a document and placed it on the table. Victor Langford contacted me 4 months ago, she said, through channels that told me he knew more about the past than anyone in his family should have known. He told me he had found his father's documents. He told me he was building a case. He asked me to come forward when he was ready. She looked at the document. He was killed before he was ready. And whoever killed him planted evidence to close the investigation before it could open. I looked at the document. It was a letter. Victor's name at the top. Margaret's address below it. Dated 11 days before his death. I had worked beside Victor Langford for 3 years. I had answered his calls and managed his calendar and brought him coffee at 7:45 every morning because that was when he needed it. I had believed, for 14 months, that I had been framed by a stranger. He had not been a stranger. He had been trying to finish what my father started. And someone had killed him for it. And framed me. And I had almost been sentenced for it. Who killed him? I asked. Margaret looked at the folder. That, she said, is what we need to prove. Adrian requested an emergency hearing for the following morning. Judge Cross granted it, which told me the photograph had done something to him that he had not yet finished processing. In 30 years on the bench, he had presumably seen most things that courtrooms produced, and the specific quality of his silence when he granted the hearing was not the silence of a man managing a procedural complication. It was the silence of a man who had recognized something in a photograph and was sitting with what that recognition meant. I spent the night in the holding facility, with Margaret's documents in Adrian's possession and Margaret's words in my head, turning the shape of everything over with the particular focused attention of someone who has been told their life is not what they understood it to be and is trying to locate the edges of the revision. My parents were James and Catherine Hale. My father had been building a case. My name was Rosie. I said it quietly in the dark of the holding room. The way you say a word you haven't used in so long it has become unfamiliar in your mouth. Rosie. It didn't sound like a stranger's name. It sounded like something I had put down a very long time ago and forgotten I was missing. The emergency hearing began at 9 the following morning. Margaret had brought everything. The folder from the conference room and 3 additional folders that Adrian had reviewed overnight with the focused sleeplessness of a lawyer who understood that the case he had been handed at midnight was the actual case, and the 14 months preceding it had been, in a meaningful sense, the wrong case entirely. The prosecutor, a woman named Claire Voss who had spent 14 months building a conviction she believed in, sat across the courtroom with the expression of someone who had also been up all night and had arrived at a different set of conclusions than Adrian. Judge Cross entered and took his seat and looked at the courtroom with the expression I had been trying to name since the previous day. I named it now. He looked like a man who had made a decision. Before we begin formal proceedings, he said, I want to address something directly. He looked at me. Miss Carter. Or Miss Hale. I want you to know that what was presented in this courtroom yesterday prompted me to review certain materials last night that I have not looked at in over 2 decades. I will not characterize what I found in those materials until the appropriate moment in these proceedings. But I want you to understand that this court takes seriously what was presented. He looked at the prosecutor. Ms. Voss, the defense will present its emergency submission. You will have full opportunity to respond. I expect both parties to approach this hearing with the understanding that we are no longer operating within the parameters of the original case. Voss looked at her notes and said nothing. Adrian stood. He presented Margaret's testimony first. Her identity, her history with the Hale family, her time in witness protection, her contact with Victor Langford 4 months before his death. He presented the letter Victor had written to Margaret. He presented the documents Margaret had kept for 23 years, original copies of materials that predated the digital era and could not have been fabricated after the fact. Then he presented the forensic issue. He had called a specialist overnight. A forensic analyst named Dr. Patricia Odom who had reviewed the original evidence and had, in the 8 hours between Adrian's call and the morning hearing, identified something the original forensic team had either missed or chosen not to pursue. The fingerprints on the murder weapon were real. They were also transferred. The object through which the transfer occurred, Adrian said, placing a photograph on the evidence table, is this pen. A pen that Emily Carter handled during a meeting with Victor Langford on the morning of his death. A pen that was subsequently used to transfer her prints to the murder weapon by someone who understood forensic transfer well enough to execute it without leaving their own prints in the process. Voss was on her feet. Your Honor, the defense is presenting overnight analysis from a specialist who has had 8 hours with the evidence as a challenge to 14 months of prosecution forensics. The defense is presenting a legitimate forensic alternative, Adrian said. One that accounts for all existing evidence without requiring my client to be guilty. Dr. Odom's analysis, Judge Cross said to Voss, will be entered into evidence and subject to full independent review. The question of whether the transfer occurred is now a question of fact for this hearing. He looked at Adrian. Continue. Adrian continued. By noon, he had presented enough to shift the hearing from a sentencing proceeding into something that was no longer about whether I had killed Victor Langford, and was now about why someone needed me convicted of killing him. Those were different questions. The second one was considerably more dangerous to whoever had framed me, which meant that whoever had framed me was now aware that the hearing had changed direction. I understood this in the lunch recess, sitting with Adrian in the conference room, when Margaret's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at Adrian and me with an expression that told me the call was significant before she said a word. I need to take this, she said. It is the person who told me Victor was dead before the police released his name. She stepped into the corridor. Adrian and I looked at each other. She has a source inside this, he said. She has had a source inside this for 23 years, I said. She found me somehow. She knew when to come forward. She knew about Victor's investigation. I paused. Someone has been watching this from the inside the entire time. Margaret came back into the room and sat down and looked at the table for a moment before she looked at us. The man who called, she said, says he has the documents Victor gathered before he died. All of them. He has been holding them in a secure location because he did not know who to trust. She paused. He says he is ready to come forward. He says he knows who killed Victor Langford. Who is he? Adrian asked. Margaret looked at me. He was a junior officer 23 years ago, she said. He worked under Gerald Osei. He was there when Gerald died. He has never believed it was a suicide. She paused. His name is Detective Raymond Osei. Raymond Osei arrived at the courthouse at 2:15. He was 52 years old, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent decades in law enforcement and had developed the specific posture of someone who was always aware of the room around them. He carried a briefcase that he placed on the conference table and did not open immediately, and he looked at me for a long moment before he looked at anyone else. You look like your father, he said. Around the eyes. I did not know what to do with that, so I said nothing, which seemed to be the correct response because he nodded once and opened the briefcase. He had been 19 years old when his father died. He had spent 33 years becoming a detective specifically because of what had happened to Gerald Osei and what Gerald had believed about the Langford family and what Raymond had understood from the contents of his father's private files had actually occurred in Crestwood County 23 years ago. He had not been able to act on any of it directly because acting on it required evidence rather than a dead father's private files, and the evidence had been buried with a thoroughness that suggested whoever buried it had access to the systems that were supposed to prevent that. Victor Langford had contacted him 6 months before his death. He came to me through a series of intermediaries, Raymond said, arranging documents on the table with the methodical care of someone who had been waiting a long time to lay them out. He had discovered his father's private records. Not the family's official financial records, which had been cleaned years ago, but personal documentation Thomas Langford had kept, apparently as a form of insurance against the people he worked with. Victor described it as his father's confession that nobody was ever supposed to read. What was in it? Adrian asked. Everything, Raymond said simply. The arrangement with the men who handled the gas leak at the Hale house. The arrangement with the person who managed Carver Willis's car accident. The financial transfers that preceded both events. The names of the people who helped bury the subsequent investigations. He paused. And the name of the person Thomas Langford paid to monitor the Hale girl after her identity was changed. to ensure she never remembered who she was. The room was very still. "Someone was watching me," I said. "The whole time." "Yes," Raymond said. "Which is how they knew you had taken the job with Victor. Which is how they understood, when Victor's investigation began producing results, that the combination of Victor's documents and your proximity to him was potentially catastrophic for them." He looked at me. "You were not framed because you killed Victor Langford. You were framed because you were Rosie Hale, and Rosie Hale becoming connected to a reopened investigation into the Langford family's past was something they could not allow." "Who are they?" I asked. Specifically. Raymond reached into the briefcase and produced a final document. "Thomas Langford died 4 years ago," he said. "The arrangement he built did not die with him. It passed to the person who had managed it on his behalf for 3 decades. A man named Clifford Wren, currently a senior partner at the law firm that has represented the Langford family for 30 years. He paused. "And currently sitting in this courthouse in the capacity of legal counsel to the Langford family, who are here as victims of the crime my client is accused of committing." Adrian set down his pen. I thought about the Langford family seated across the courtroom for 14 months, watching me with the stillness of people who had already decided what I was. They had not simply been grieving relatives of a murder victim. At least one of them had known exactly what Victor had been doing before he died, and had made sure he couldn't finish it. "Raymond," Margaret said quietly, "tell them about the judge." Raymond looked at his hands briefly before looking up. "Judge Warren Cross," he said, "was a junior prosecutor in Crestwood County 23 years ago. He handled part of the Hale case file after your parents died. He reviewed evidence and signed off on the closure of the investigation." He paused. "He was given a file that had been edited, key evidence removed before it reached him. He made decisions based on what he was given, and what he was given was not the full picture." He paused again. "He has spent 23 years believing he did his job correctly. He did his job correctly. His job was simply given to him with holes in it he had no way of knowing existed." "He recognized something in the photograph," I said. "Yes," Raymond said. "The man standing slightly apart from you and Margaret in that photograph is Thomas Langford. The judge recognized him because he had seen that face in the Hale case file 23 years ago, and the face had been identified to him as a family friend who had no relevant connection to the investigation." He looked at the table. "He has spent since yesterday evening understanding that the family friend was the reason there was an investigation to close." The conference room was quiet. I looked at the documents spread across the table. 33 years of a detective's careful work, 23 years of a housekeeper's hidden survival, for months of a man's courageous attempt to correct his father's crimes, all of it converging in a conference room off the main corridor of a courthouse where this morning I had been 40 minutes from a murder sentence. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Adrian said, picking up his pen, "we go back in there and we finish it." The afternoon session began at 3. Raymond Osei was entered as an emergency witness, a process that required 40 minutes of procedural argument between Adrian and Voss that Judge Cross managed with the focused patience of a man who had decided the outcome of the argument before it began and was simply allowing it to complete itself. Raymond took the stand. He presented the documents systematically, the way a detective presents evidence, each piece establishing the foundation for the next, building a structure that was designed to hold weight rather than simply to impress. He identified Thomas Langford's private records. He identified the financial transfers. He identified the names of the men who had handled the events 23 years ago, 2 of whom were deceased and 1 of whom, he noted with the specific calm of a man delivering a fact he had been sitting on for 33 years, was currently employed by the Crestwood County Municipal Records Office. The courtroom was the particular quiet of a room absorbing something that was simultaneously the size of a single family's tragedy and the size of a system's failure, both at once, neither diminishing the other. Voss cross-examined Raymond with the professional rigor of a prosecutor who was doing her job even as her job was being redefined underneath her. She challenged the chain of custody of Thomas Langford's documents. She challenged the timeline of Raymond's contact with Victor. She challenged the connection between a 23-year-old case and the present murder charge. Raymond answered each challenge with the measured precision of a man who had spent 33 years anticipating them. Then Adrian called Margaret. She took the stand with the same unhurried certainty she had brought to every other moment since she walked into the back of a courtroom that morning, and she told the story I had heard in fragments across the day in its full sequential form, from the night she got a 6-year-old girl out of a house where her parents had just died to the moment she had watched that same girl almost be sentenced for a murder she did not commit. She told it without drama. She did not need drama. The facts were sufficient. The moment that changed the quality of the room's silence was when she described the 2 weeks she had spent with me after my parents' death, before Gerald Osei had arranged the new identity. She described a 6-year-old who had stopped speaking for 11 days and then one morning had simply said, in a small, steady voice, that she was hungry and could she have toast. She said she had made the toast and watched the child eat it and understood in that moment that whatever had been done to this family, the child was going to survive it. I promised her mother, Margaret said, to a courtroom that was very still, that I would find her if she was ever in danger. Catherine Hale was the finest person I have ever known. I was not going to let her daughter be convicted of a crime designed to bury the truth about her murder. She stepped down. Adrian called Dr. Patricia Odom to present the forensic transfer analysis. Odom was precise and technical and explained the mechanism of fingerprint transfer in language calibrated for a courtroom rather than a laboratory, and by the end of her testimony the question of whether the forensic evidence against me was manufactured was no longer a question. It was a finding. Voss said very little during Odom's cross-examination. I watched her across the courtroom and understood that she was doing what honest prosecutors do when the evidence shifts. She was reassessing rather than defending, which was the appropriate response, and which told me something useful about her character, even in a moment when character was not the primary concern. Judge Cross had been taking notes throughout the afternoon session with the focused attention of someone building something rather than simply recording. At 4:45, he called a recess and asked both counsel and Raymond Osei and Margaret Ellis to join him in chambers. I waited in the courtroom with 2 guards and the Langford family across the room and Clifford Wren, who had been seated behind them all day in his capacity as their legal counsel, and who had spent the afternoon session in the particular stillness of a man watching a structure he built being taken apart piece by piece and calculating how much of it was still standing. I looked at him once. He looked at me once. Then he looked at his phone and began typing with the focused urgency of a man who understood that whatever was happening in chambers was going to produce a consequence he needed to prepare for. He should have put the phone down. Raymond Osei had spent 33 years understanding that the people who thought they were managing a situation were always, at the critical moment, the ones most visible. There was a camera in that courtroom. There had been a camera in that courtroom all day. What happened in chambers took 40 minutes. I know the shape of it from what Adrian told me afterward, sitting in the conference room with Margaret and Raymond while the building processed around us in the particular way that large institutions process things that are bigger than their ordinary operations. Judge Cross had opened the chambers meeting by placing Thomas Langford's photograph on his desk. The same photograph Margaret had brought into the courtroom that morning, the one with the 6-year-old girl and the elderly woman and the man standing slightly apart. He had looked at it for a moment, and then he had said to the room that he needed to understand something before the next session, and what he needed to understand was whether the decisions he had made 23 years ago as a junior prosecutor had contributed to the situation currently before his court. Raymond had told him the truth. The file he had been given 23 years ago had been edited before it reached him. The evidence of Thomas Langford's involvement had been removed. The witnesses who might have pointed in Langford's direction had been discredited before they could be interviewed by anyone in Cross's office. He had been given a clean, coherent, completely misleading picture of a case and had made decisions based on it that a reasonable prosecutor with that information would have made. He had not been corrupt. He had been managed. Cross had sat with that for a long time, Adrian said, in the particular silence of a man integrating something that required significant revision of a self-understanding he had carried for 3 decades. Then he had asked what was needed from the court to complete what was now clearly a reopened investigation into events that had begun 23 years ago and had not, despite everyone's best efforts, actually ended. Adrian had told him. Raymond had told him. Margaret had told him. The session resumed at 6:15. The courtroom had thinned during the recess, but the people who remained were the people who mattered, both counsel, both sets of parties, the Langford family in their row, Clifford Wren behind them, Raymond and Margaret in the gallery, and me at the defense table understanding that the next hour was either the end of something or the beginning of something and possibly, if the day had gone the way it appeared to have gone, both simultaneously. Judge Cross took a seat. He looked at the courtroom with the expression I had been naming and renaming since the previous morning, and which I finally understood completely. It was the expression of a man who had decided to be honest about something difficult in public, which was a different kind of courage than the kind that arrived with noise. "This court has heard testimony today," he said, "that establishes a pattern of events beginning 23 years ago and extending to the present case. The court has reviewed forensic analysis indicating that evidence central to the prosecution's case was manipulated. The court has received documentation establishing a credible alternative account of the events surrounding Victor Langford's death." He paused. "The court has also become aware of information suggesting that an individual currently present in this courtroom may have material connection to both the events of 23 years ago and the murder of Victor Langford." Clifford Wren looked up from his phone. "Mr. Wren," Judge Cross said, "please remain seated." Two officers who had entered the courtroom during the recess were already positioned. Wren looked at the officers. Then he looked at Raymond Osei in the gallery, and Raymond Osei looked back at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting 33 years for this specific moment and had found it exactly as he had imagined it. "This court is issuing an emergency stay of all sentencing proceedings in the matter of Emily Carter," Judge Cross said, "pending full investigation of the matters raised in today's testimony. The defendant is to be released from custody effective immediately." He looked at me directly for the first time since the morning. "Miss Hale, this court apologizes for the role these proceedings have played in extending an injustice that began before you were old enough to understand it. That apology is inadequate to the circumstances. It is offered nonetheless." I looked at the judge. I thought about 14 months of telling the truth to people who had been given excellent reasons not to believe me. I thought about a 6-year-old eating toast. I thought about my father building a case, and my mother teaching school, and a housekeeper who had kept a promise for 23 years. "Thank you," I said. It was not adequate either. Some moments are larger than the language available for them. Clifford Wren was arrested in the courtroom. He did not go quietly, which surprised no one who had spent the afternoon watching him calculate, and he said several things in the process of being escorted out that his lawyer would later describe as unhelpful to his case, which was the legal profession's version of an understatement. The man from the Municipal Records Office was arrested the following morning. The investigation into the events of 23 years ago was formally reopened by the State Attorney General's office within 48 hours of the courtroom session, which was the fastest I had ever seen an institution move, and which Raymond told me later was less about institutional speed and more about the fact that the Attorney General had watched the courtroom footage and understood that whatever response came next was going to be on record in a way that made slowness its own kind of statement. I was released from custody on a Tuesday evening. Margaret was waiting outside. She had a car, which she had borrowed from Raymond's wife, and she drove me to a hotel that Raymond had arranged because I did not have an apartment to return to, having lost the lease during the 14 months of proceedings, which was a practical problem I found I was entirely capable of managing given that the alternative problems I had been dealing with for the past day made a lost apartment feel remarkably straightforward. We sat in the hotel room and ordered room service because neither of us had eaten properly since the previous morning, and Margaret said that whatever else happened, a person needed to eat, which was the most Margaret sentence I had heard from her and which made me understand, in a small sudden way, why a 6-year-old who had lost everything had eaten toast when Margaret made it. Because Margaret made things feel manageable. She had been doing it for 23 years from a distance. She was doing it now from across a hotel room table. "Tell me about them," I said. "My parents." She told me. She told me about my father's laugh, which she described as the kind that arrived before the joke was finished, because he always found things funny slightly ahead of everyone else. She told me about my mother's habit of reading 2 books simultaneously, one serious and one not, because she said the brain needed both kinds of exercise. She told me about Sunday mornings in the Hale house when my father made pancakes that were never quite the right shape, and my mother pretended they were perfect, and I apparently had opinions about both positions. She told me about the garden my mother kept, the specific blue of the front door my father had painted one summer weekend, the dog they had, a large disorganized animal named Bernard who had no business being named Bernard and who had loved everyone he encountered with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of something that had never encountered a reason not to. She told me until the room service arrived, and then while we ate, and then after, until the hotel room was full of a family I had not known I was missing and had apparently been missing for 23 years without the specific language to describe what the absence felt like. I did not cry during any of it. Not because I wasn't moved. Because the feeling was too large for crying and too important for anything smaller than sitting with it completely, which was what I did, in a hotel room on a Tuesday evening, while a 74-year-old woman who had kept a promise to my mother for 2 decades told me who I had come from. At some point past midnight, Margaret said she needed to sleep, and I agreed, and she took the bed and I took the couch because she was 74 and had been on her feet since before the courtroom that morning, and some things required no negotiation. Before she slept, she said, from the other side of the room, without preamble, "Your mother would be very proud of you." I looked at the ceiling. "She would be proud of you," I said. "You kept your promise." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Get some sleep, Rosie," she said. It was the second time she had called me that. It felt, the second time, like something settling into place that had been slightly displaced for 23 years. I slept better than I had in 14 months. The trial of Clifford Wren began 4 months later. I did not attend every day. I attended the days that mattered, which Adrian identified for me with the practical efficiency of a lawyer who understood that a client's relationship with a courtroom was complicated after 14 months of being the defendant in one, and who had apparently decided that part of his job now was managing that complication with some care. The case the prosecution built against Wren was the case Raymond Osei had spent 33 years preparing without knowing that was what he was doing. Thomas Langford's private documents, the financial transfers, the testimony of the man from the Municipal Records Office who had accepted a plea arrangement in exchange for cooperation and who turned out to know considerably more than anyone had anticipated, including the identity of the person who had transferred my fingerprints to the murder weapon. It had been a forensic technician employed by the firm Wren used for private investigations. The technician also accepted a plea arrangement. Wren did not. Wren maintained his innocence through the full proceedings with the particular persistence of a man who had spent 30 years managing situations and believed that one more situation could be managed if he simply continued to insist on a version of events long enough for everyone to become uncertain. The jury was not uncertain. They deliberated for 6 hours. Wren was convicted on 2 counts of murder, 1 count of conspiracy, and 4 counts of obstruction, the last of which covered the 23 years of evidence management that had begun with a junior prosecutor being handed an edited file and had ended in a courtroom with an elderly woman holding a photograph. Judge Cross was not the presiding judge at Wren's trial. He had recused himself voluntarily and publicly, citing his historical connection to the Hale case and his determination that the proceedings should be entirely free of any appearance that required management. The statement he released was 2 paragraphs, precise and honest, acknowledging that 23 years ago he had been given incomplete information and had made decisions based on it that he would not have made with a complete picture, and that the justice system he had served for 3 decades had been used against a child, and then against that child as an adult, and that while he bore no deliberate responsibility for either outcome, he bore a professional one, and he intended to spend the remainder of his career ensuring that the procedural failures that had allowed both to occur were addressed at the systemic level. It was not a dramatic statement. It was an honest one. Those were not always the same thing and were, in my experience, rarely the same thing in institutions that had significant reasons to prefer the dramatic version. The morning after Wren's conviction, I drove to Crestwood County. It was a 2-hour drive, and I made it alone because this was something I needed to arrive at by myself. Not because I didn't want company, but because some arrivals required solitude the way some work required quiet, not as a preference but as a condition. The cemetery was on the eastern edge of the county, well kept, the kind of place that suggested people came regularly to maintain it rather than leaving its maintenance entirely to the institution. I had the plot location from the county records Raymond had helped me access 3 months earlier. I found it without difficulty.
James Hale, Catherine Hale.
The stones were simple, which I understood from Margaret was consistent with who they had been, people who found simplicity more honest than elaboration. I stood between the 2 headstones for a long time. I had brought the photograph. Margaret's original, which she had given me after the hearing with the particular lack of ceremony of someone returning something to its rightful owner. The 6-year-old girl and the elderly woman and Thomas Langford standing slightly apart, the image that had stopped a sentencing and opened 23 years of closed doors. I placed it between the 2 headstones. The morning was quiet around me in the way that mornings are quiet in places where quiet is the appropriate register. I thought about everything Margaret had told me in the hotel room. The laugh that arrived before the joke finished. The 2 books simultaneously. The pancakes that were never quite the right shape. The dog named Bernard, who had loved everyone he encountered. I thought about a 6-year-old who had stopped speaking for 11 days and then asked for toast. I thought about the 33 years Raymond Osei had spent becoming a detective so he could finish what his father started. I thought about Victor Langford, who had found his father's confession and decided that finishing it was worth the risk, and had been right about the importance and wrong about his own safety, and who deserved to be remembered as someone who tried to correct the thing his family had done rather than as a victim in a case that had almost buried the correction, along with everything else. I looked at the 2 headstones. I had not spoken to my parents since I was 6 years old. I had not known, for 23 of those years, that I had parents to speak to, parents beyond the Carter family who had raised me with genuine love and genuine care, and who had been told only what Gerald Osei had determined was safe to tell them, which was not the full truth but which had been, in the circumstances, the best available version of protection. I opened my mouth. The morning was quiet. "I finally know who I am," I said. My voice sounded the way voices sound in quiet outdoor places, present and then absorbed, said, and then part of the air around the saying. I stood there for a while longer. Then I picked up the photograph from between the headstones and looked at it one final time. The 6-year-old girl who had eaten toast and survived and grown up and been framed and been almost sentenced and been found by a woman who kept a promise, and I placed it back down. I left it there. Some things belonged where they had been placed. I walked back to the car. Margaret was waiting at Raymond's house for lunch, which she had insisted on organizing because she said I had been eating hotel food for too long, and that regardless of everything else a person needed a proper meal, which was the most Margaret position available and which I had agreed to without argument, because some things did not require argument. I drove toward lunch. The morning continued around me in its ordinary way, the county road and the fields and the light doing what light did in early autumn, which was to make everything slightly more itself than it had been in summer. My name was Rosie Hale. I had been Emily Carter for 23 years, and I had built a life under that name that was real and mine and not going to be discarded because the name had changed, because names were not lives and lives were not reducible to what you were called, even when what you were called was the first thing taken from you. I was both. I intended to remain both. Not as a compromise. As the fullest available version of a person who had survived something designed to erase her and had arrived, at 29 years old, at the beginning of understanding what that survival was actually for. The road continued. I drove toward lunch and Margaret and whatever came next. It was, all things considered, an excellent direction. If this story stayed with you today, hit the like button before you go and leave me a comment telling me the moment that hit you hardest. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who needs a story about what justice actually looks like when it finally arrives, and I will see you in the next one.